Good morning, everybody. This is Stephen Pugh of the Home Bible College. I want to do another installment in my series on the life of Paul. This is video number 14, and we need to talk about some other Jewish sects. Now, there were a number of sects which just need to be mentioned. First of all, there were the Essenes. Now, the Essenes, as far as we can tell, are not mentioned in Scripture. They were a very exclusive sect, so they kept themselves away from everybody else in society to prevent themselves from being influenced by the religious and the political system of which they did not approve. This is why they probably are not mentioned in Scripture, as far as we can tell. They lived out their lives in quiet, deserted places, either high in the mountains or low in the deserts and in the caves of the Jordan Valley, where they spent their time in quiet contemplation and spiritual exercises, and they lived their life in an exclusive community. Okay. Now, another party, another sect, were what the Scripture refers to as the Zealots. Okay, they were immortalized by reference to Simon the Zealot in Luke chapter 16, verse 15. They were politically motivated to resist and even oppose the Roman occupation of the Holy Land. They were a small group of freedom fighters, but they had a very large popular following, a huge popular following. Today we would call them terrorists, because of their politically motivated raids and assassinations. On the opposite end of the spectrum were the Herodians. You see that all the society in biblical times were of every type of variety of a social life. So at the opposite end of the spectrum were the Herodians, the Zealots on one end and the Herodians on the other. Now, these people, the Herodians, are twice mentioned in the Gospels, in Mark chapter 3, verse 6, and Matthew chapter 22, verse 16. They believed that their best hope of achieving a better life for Israel was in attachment to the Herodian family. And they thought that this despotic family would be able to bring about the political change that would be a benefit for everyone. Now, there's another group not mentioned in Scripture. They were the Therapeutae. This was a very influential group who had influence in as far as Egypt and lived in even greater isolation than the Essenes. And then we have another group called the Samaritans. The Samaritans were, in contrast, a very large and influential ethnic grouping, being mentioned in John chapter 4 and in other places. These people were the descendants of the people who came out of the Assyrian invasion. The Assyrians not only invaded, but they carried away the northern tribes, the 9 tribes, but put their own people back in, both to occupy the land and to marry the young women of those tribes, and thus producing a mixed race, which was not specifically Israelite or Assyrian, but a mix of the two. And the Jews of Judea refused fellowship with them because of their mixed heritage, and thus the Samaritans developed their own rival worship, their own priesthood, and they developed their own places of worship. After the conquests of Alexander, there were great tracts of land right across the ancient world that had Greek language as their international language, and the life of Saul was greatly influenced by Greek culture, although he owed so much more to Jewish life and thinking than to the Greeks. He did, however, learn much of the arithmetic and science, so-called, of the Greeks, with their love of the sea. Saul, living in a seaport, would have conversed with the Western and Eastern civilizations, and he would have met Egyptian and Cilician cultures. Now, where Paul lived was right at the very center of east to west and north to south. It was a pivotal point Tarsus was a so there was it was a sort of a place where all nations had to go through to reach other places. The Jews of the Holy Land had taken the language of the Aramaeans rather than the old Hebrew language, and this language, which takes its name from Aram, we call Aramaic, was originally the language of Christ and the Apostle Paul of his childhood. In Palestine, there were two strains of the dialect of Aramaic, the Chaldee or the Syrian tongue, which was Eastern centered on Babylon. And then there was the Western Hebrew of the previous Old Testament times. The Hebrew of the New Testament is almost always Aramaic. The capital of the Greek culture was Alexandria, and the biblical text that was common throughout the ancient world was the Septuagint. The Septuagint, nearly all of the questions of Christ, quotations of Christ, are from the Septuagint. In text, it's referred to as LXX. And the people who use this language are called the Hellenists, or Jews of the Grecian speak. Sometimes they're referred to as Grecians. The word Grecian in the Acts differentiates those who are Greek-speaking Israelites from the Greeks themselves. It was this group who afforded the need for the 7 deacons to be appointed to supervise the daily distribution of food to the poor widows of Jerusalem. This difference between Aramaic-speaking Jews and Greek-speaking Israelites was the cause of great confusion and resentment when the Grecians were thought of as being neglected. It's very interesting that Paul, in his Old Testament quotations, almost always quotes from the Septuagint, and most of the time from memory. Paul, being a Hellenist, was Greek in speech, but Hebrew in theology. It's very interesting, that the Bible, the New Testament, is Greek language, but with Hebrew theology. Got that now? Hebrew culture and Hebrew thinking, but conveyed in Greek. And some of the New Testament books, Matthew, for example, probably was originally written in Hebrew, or possibly even written in Aramaic, and then translated probably by the author himself into Greek. Paul, being a Hellenist, was Greek in speech, but Hebrew in theology, which was not an unusual thing at all. The whole population of Palestine was Aramean, and yet there was plenty of Hellenistic synagogues where the whole of the service in the synagogue was conducted in Greek. Palestine was therefore linked by language to Babylon, by Aramaic, but Antioch and Tarsus and Alexandria were Greek. They were Hellenistic and more linked to the Greek language. It's no wonder that Paul's letters were written in Greek. The Jews of Palestine often refused to use the Greek language and despised it and considered it as unworthy of them or unclean. And Paul, while using Greek more often, did, however, learn the Aramaic as a child, as his first language, and called himself a Hebrew of the Hebrews. It was the language of his home and of his primary school and of his religious education. It's not able to be established, in fact, but it is very likely that the letters, the general letters of the New Testament, Hebrews, James, and so on, are probably originally written in Aramaic or Hebrew, because they're all addressed to the Hebrews. Well, there we are. We're looking forward to moving forward. Next session will be the early life of Paul and his infancy in Tarsus, and we look forward to catching up with you then. Have a great day. Bye for now.